We're in Hebrews 7. We had gotten down to verse 4. But what I wanted to do to start out this morning is let's first turn to the 110th Psalm. I want to see something in regards to trying to make a point on something. Verse 1 starts out, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit thou on my right hand until I make thine enemies thy footstool." What's he saying about the Lord here? Lord being Jesus, of course. And he dealing with kingship?
Receiving his power.
Well, the Lord shall send the rod of thy strength out of Zion. Rule thou in the midst of thine enemies. That's kingship. Thy people shall be willing in the days of thy power, and the beauties of holiness from the womb of the morning. Thou hast the dew of thy youth. The Lord has sworn and will not repent. Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Well, now then we have priesthood, don't we? King and priest. What does that imply?
Well, it implies the premillennialism is false for one thing. I don't know what else it implies.
What should it have implied to the Jews? Let me put it that read this.
That the Mosaic law was over with, that he was now priest, and the priests were of no count to them, or no value to them.
Okay.
Kings were of no use. It was a spiritual kingdom now, not a secular and a spiritual.
What did the Jew know in relationship to the king as to what tribe he came from?
Came from the tribe of Judah, didn't he?
Yeah. What did they know about someone who's going to be a priest? What tribe did he come from? Levi. Here in 110th Psalm, you have a prophecy that they knew very well, and they would recite of someone who's going to be a king and a priest. Well, wait, you can't have that, can you? Not under Judaism.
That should imply that Judaism couldn't accomplish it, so that Judaism is irrelevant as a religious guide.
They should have known that Judaism has to come to an end in order for this prophecy to be fulfilled. Did they recognize that? No. Same thing in Zechariah 6, 12, and 13.
The disciples were even confused about it because they asked, "Well, I'll restore the kingdom."
Yeah, they were.
They were.
So the point, though, is, and it comes back to the aspect, they read these things daily, did not recognize the implications of them. So why should we be surprised, number one, when people today read the Bible and don't realize the implications of it? No, yeah. 1,500 years of history. But they didn't realize what they read. And now then, Paul is going to, in this chapter, bring this point home, and it's a discussion that Christ is a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Well, what about Melchizedek? We had no genealogical record of him. That's verse 3. No descent, no beginning of days, no end of days, or life, no mother, no father. What is that? That's regarding priesthood. We emphasized that last week.
I'm kind of confused because I guess I'm dense because you got the record in Genesis 5 and 11, and they come up to Luke 3 and Matthew 1 and all that stuff. That's the special genealogy, though. Is that what you mean? The record leading up to Christ through Abraham and David, and back to Adam. You got all those genealogies there. What is that? How does that tie in?
Well, that's a genealogical record of Christ.
Yeah, but don't he have a genealogy? He has one that
Not
way.
With regards to priesthood, he does not.
Oh. Well, what does that relate to then? That don't relate to priesthood.
He is a priest after the order of Melchizedek.
Right, I understand.
Melchizedek doesn't have any genealogical record regarding his priesthood. He doesn't have a mother. He doesn't have a father. Did he physically? Well, yes.
Yeah.
Did he from his priesthood? No. There's no genealogical record of, there is no way to have a genealogical record of Christ's priesthood.
No, because he's from Judah and not from Levi.
Well, he's, for one thing, as is going to be pointed out here in Hebrews 7, he is an eternal priest.
Receive it from man.
And he could not receive it from man. Yeah. Neither did Melchizedek receive it from man. It wasn't handed down. Christ's priesthood wasn't handed down from someone else. And that's the reason he brings up Melchizedek, that he's a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Now then, in verse 4, consider how great this man was, Melchizedek, of course, unto whom even the patriarch Abraham gave the tenth of the spoils. Consider. I think it's an interesting word. See if y'all see a word here in this. Make sure I don't. I did forget a letter. Theory. Yeah. To theorize. Thorio. Thank you.
Don't that also tie to Theos, the prefix?
No.
No.
Where's the mail?
Theorio.
Double stuff.
It is. Yeah. I was afraid somebody would bring up Oreo cookies. Double stuff ones. Theorize, though. It literally means to scrutinize intently. It is a critical, discriminating inspection. So you consider, scrutinize intently, you discriminate, critical, discriminating inspection of this. In other words, he's trying to take a 2x4 and knock him upside the head and say, listen here, pay attention to this. This is something important. What? How great Melchizedek is. Because to the Jewish mind, there was no one greater than Abraham. We're children of Abraham. That's it. There's no one in the history of the Old Testament that's greater than Abraham. Yet they had read Genesis, the 14th chapter, how many thousands of times through those years, and they didn't realize the very point that Paul is going to make here. You think Abraham is great and the greatness of Abraham, here's someone greater. So you consider how great this man was. And so to prove that, even the patriarch Abraham, word patriarch means father rule. It is made up of two words actually, and those are the two words, father and rule. Now, Abraham, as a patriarch, what did patriarchs do?
Sign over their family's spiritual welfare.
Okay, they ruled as a priest and as a prophet. Remember Job, he would daily offer sacrifices for his children. He was a priest, acting as priest of the family. As a prophet, he was God's spokesman to the family. So Abraham, now he mentioned, here's the father, patriarch Abraham. What was Abraham? Priest and prophet in regards to his family. Well, this patriarch Abraham gave the tenth of the spoils to Melchizedek. Spoils is from an interesting word. It has a rich history. It literally means the topmost part of the heap. Topmost part of the heap. Now then, the historical reference to that is that the Greeks, after a victory, would gather all the spoils in a huge heap. The choicest parts, the pick of the spoils, in other words, would first go to their gods. The next top part of the heap would go to the king. The next part of the heap would go to the generals, and on down until you get to the little peon soldier who gets whatever's left over. Now then, Abraham, what happened? He goes to recover Lot, his family, and all that has been taken. He's on his way back home. What happens? He gives the topmost part of the heap to Melchizedek. That's what this is saying, actually. The tenth of the spoils. Literally the topmost part of the heap. The very best things went to Melchizedek. Now then, what does that do? That immediately shows Abraham is showing the greatness of Melchizedek. The word tenth here is the same word as tithes in verse 5 and also back in verse 2. So he gave a tenth, most part, or the top of the heap, to Melchizedek. In verse 5 then, and verily they that are the sons of Levi who receive the office of the priesthood have commandment to take tithes of the people according to the law, that is, of their brethren, through whom, or though they come out of the loin of Abraham. They that are sons, the word translated are there. They that are of the sons is this Greek word that we've talked about before. Ek. What does it mean? Out from within. More complete word. Out from within. They that are of the sons of Levi, they that came out from within Levi. Point is, not all the sons of Levi became priests. Isn't that right? Only part of them did. Those who belonged to the family of Aaron became priests. But Levi had other sons other than Aaron and other families.
How many sons did he have?
I believe it was 3.
Merari and the other guy?
Gershom
Yeah.
and I've forgotten the other one's name. But only one of them, those only of the family of Aaron, became priest. Now then, the Aaronic priest, now and that's who we're dealing with now, the Aaronic priest took tithes of their brethren by legal appointment only. What right did they have to take tithes of their brethren?
Well, the law of Moses.
Law of Moses. That's the only reason. Have a commandment to take tithes. Now then, the point becomes, we're showing the greatness of Melchizedek. Here's Melchizedek taking a 10th part of the spoils. Here's the Levitical priests are taking a 10th tithes from their brethren. By what right do the Levites have to take that 10th? By commandment only. They have a commandment to do it. Does that make the tribe of Levi or those who were Levites greater than their brethren? Does it show greatness? No. They were equal, and there's the legal command to take tithes or pay tithes. Was there any law or command that required Abraham to pay tithes to Melchizedek? Or were there any legal commandment for Melchizedek to take tithes of anyone? No, there wasn't. So see the comparison that Paul is making to show, and again, you consider carefully this point. Now, I imagine they had never thought about anything along this line before. That here, Levi and those Levitical priests, the only reason and the only right they have to take a 10th, or the tithe, is by law. Melchizedek there wasn't a law relating to that in his relationship with Abraham and to take tithes of Abraham. What was it? Abraham was showing how great he was. While the Levites, it's only by law. Doesn't show their greatness in relationship to their brethren. No. Yeah, we're required to.
I'm just wondering why Melchizedek would even meet Abraham. I guess
He was coming back Abraham was coming back through that
I understand
way.
all that, but I guess to set up in God's foreknowledge for our benefit later, like we're having this fast now. I guess the Lord realized we would need this edification later.
It is a typology that sets forth the greatness of Melchizedek so that he shows through that typology the greatness of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Christ is greater.
So the Lord wanted to have a way to teach us that Christ was great, and so he did this to plan for it.
That's one reason, yes.
Okay.
But what Abraham does, and again, this goes back to verse 5, Or verse 4, you consider how great this man is. How do we see that? Abraham shows his own inferiority to Melchizedek, and you consider Abraham the greatest of the great. And yet he's showing his inferiority to Melchizedek. Now, we've got a priest after the order of Melchizedek here, and you're going to leave him and go back into this inferior system. That's the whole point that Paul is making through this. Paul was a master logician. The greatness of this letter is just amazing when you really sit down to study it. Verse 6, but he whose descent is not counted from them received tithes of Abraham and blessed him that had the promises. Descent is the same word as pedigree in verse 3. Or it's literally pedigree. And has no pedigree. Well, now then, he whose descent, whose pedigree, is not counted of them. Melchizedek had no part in the Levitical genealogy. And thus he had no, and again, legal right to exact tithes from Abraham.
What's pedigree relate to in verse 3? The descent or the father?
Descent.
Descent, thank you.
Same word, and both of them literally meaning pedigree. Melchizedek had no legal right to exact tithes from Abraham. Abraham had no legal obligation to take them, but he shows Melchizedek's superiority by giving them. And so he whose descent, it's not from the Levitical priesthood. His pedigree doesn't come from them. There's no genealogical record that's associated with Melchizedek. But he took those tithes from that one who had received the blessing and the promises by God. Melchizedek accepted also the position that Abraham gave him, and also Melchizedek blessed Abraham. Now then, actually, Paul's going to make a play on this. He blessed Abraham who had the promises. Abraham had received the promises of God, chapter 12. And now then, Melchizedek is blessing Abraham, who had the promises. That's what Melchizedek did. He recognizes his own greatness, and he accepts the greatness that Abraham is showing. In verse 7, thus, without contradiction, the less is blessed of the better. Contradiction. The endings get me sometimes. What would it be?
Against logic.
Close.
Against word?
Against word. Logos. The ending, that's why I said gets me sometimes. You're dealing with variation of the ending. It's basically logos. That's what this logia is from, logos. Actually, logic would be from logos, but anti, against, word. There's no word against this. You can't say a word against it. That's what he's saying with this word contradiction. You can't contradict it. You cannot say a word against it. And thus it means without dispute. No one can dispute what Paul is saying here. You cannot bless another individual unless you are superior to them. Someone greater has to bless the inferior. So if Melchizedek blesses Abraham, then what does that mean? Abraham is less than Melchizedek. Again, he is establishing this point, the greatness of Melchizedek over even Abraham. How do you prove it? Well, Melchizedek blessed Abraham. And you cannot argue with, you cannot dispute that the less is blessed by the greater.
And the less there was Moses.
Abraham.
Abraham.
The less is Abraham in this situation. The better would be Melchizedek, because Melchizedek blessed Abraham. And another argument that he's already used, the receiving of tithes. Not by legal command, but by recognition of superiority.
Was there ever another record of a priest like Melchizedek?
No.
You know, all these other people were patriarchs and priests in their own right. God raised them up for a reason. Apparently the world, definitely the world was a smaller place then as far as where they were at, and apparently Abraham knew of him.
We've known of his greatness. There's no other record likened to Melchizedek, though. During the patriarchal period, if you want to talk about the priesthood, even in the patriarchal system, would have been handed down from the father. The oldest father, when he dies off, then the next oldest father of the family would have been taking that priesthood role, and so even it would have been with descent in that case, or genealogical record. That's why Melchizedek stands out so much in contrast. There is nothing along that line. He just appears and he disappears.
So Isaac, when he sold his birthright, not only sold his property that he would inherit, but also the ability
The
to
blessing.
increase or the patriarchal family.
The blessing in regards to the family.
Is that Isaac?
Esau.
Yeah, he received the blessing as opposed to his brother Esau. So that would have been, he's receiving that aspect of being the leader of the family along that line. Verse 8. And here men that die receive tithes, but there he receiveth them, of whom it is witness that he liveth. Notice the contrast here and there. What does here refer to?
Then and there, but that
No. No. Okay. Here refers to according to the Levitical priestly system. There would thus refer to Melchizedek. So here men die that receive tithes. What's he talking about? Who receive tithes? Well, the Levitical priesthood by right of commandment. But what happens to them? They die. So the here has reference to the Levitical priestly system. Men that die. Die is from a Greek word meaning to die off, and here dying. In other words, dying men receive tithes. When they receive tithes, what is it? They're dying. Kind of like us. We're all dying. And it may not be for a long period of time till we actually die, but we are dying. From the time that we're born, we are dying. Well, dying men receive tithes. And again, it refers to the Israel and Levites. Why? Because they were succeeded. What happened to the Levitical priest? He died. What happened to that? Someone comes and takes his place. What happens to him? He dies. Someone else comes and takes his place. Dying men receive tithes. Here. Now again, here, dealing with the Levitical priestly system. But as opposed to that, and thus, there, he receiveth them of whom it is witnessed that he liveth. What is that? The context shows the aspect of he liveth as being as he is not succeeded by another one. That goes back to he is without descent. And thus, he, Melchizedek, is still receiving the tithes.
Would that be a case of implication by the content, by the definition of the word?
Not implication, it's just the context.
Oh, okay.
The context is, he liveth what? He is not succeeded by another individual. What happens? Levitical priesthood as opposed to Melchizedek. Levitical priesthood, men that are dying. They die, they're succeeded by someone else. He lives, what is it? He's not succeeded by anyone else because he continues to live. They receive tithes by legal right. He received tithes by greatness. And because he lives, or he liveth, what is it? He's still receiving tithes, is Paul's argument. Melchizedek is still receiving tithes because he liveth. He's not succeeded by someone else. Levitical priests, they die off. They no longer receive the tithes. Someone has to be the successor to them. And now then, verse 9, and as I may say so, Levi also, who receiveth tithes, paid tithes in Abraham. This and statement, and as I so say, may so say. Literally, it is, so to speak, a word. So to speak, a word. It's used to introduce an unusual statement. One that's paradoxical to the reader. It's kind of like, now here's a shocking statement.
Is there another example of this in the Bible?
I can't think of one just offhand, but there might be. But this is going to surprise you. This is going to startle you. It's unusual in its nature. That's the meaning of this term. Doesn't make it any less true, but to them, it is. I imagine to them, all of this is surprising. And now then he says something, and this is really going to surprise you now.
I bet this epistle got the Judaizers mad as well hens, didn't it?
I'm sure they were already that way. But this is just devastating to any Jew who would consider leaving Christianity to go back into Judaism. Now, what is this startling statement? Levi also. who's receiving the tithes, how is he receiving them? By legal right. Right? Because there's a commandment there. He paid tithes in Abraham. He was still in the loins of Abraham, though he hadn't been born. Levi wouldn't be born for, what, hundreds of years later. Or possibly hundreds. So he wasn't even thought of yet. Not even a glimmer of thought. And yet, it is saying, because he is a descendant of Abraham, when Abraham pays tithes to Melchizedek, Levi is also paying tithes to Melchizedek. Which one's greater thus? Melchizedek is. This is all going back to that in verse 4. Consider how great this man is. Now, when these Jews read Genesis, the 14th chapter, and those very few verses about Abraham giving tithes to Melchizedek, do you think they even imagined all of these things, the implications of it? Not a chance. And that's why this, no doubt, this section of Hebrews is just so surprising to them. I mean, they must have just stood there or sat there in shock because they didn't understand these things. Verse 10, for he was yet in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. There's a tendency to view heredity in this manner. That since Levi descended from Abraham, when Abraham, again, who is the greatest person in the Old Testament period, paid tithes to Melchizedek, Levi also paid tithes to Melchizedek, showing Melchizedek was superior to Levi, and thus to Aaron. The Aaronic priesthood, high priest, all of that, they're inferior to Melchizedek. Now, what do we have? We have a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Okay.
The word for in verse 10, is that gone?
Yes, it is.
So is that showing the purpose for what he just mentioned previously in that case?
I think explanation more, which would be the normal use of gar, is here's the reason or here's the explanation of that Levi paid tithes and Abraham. Why? Here's the reason. He was yet in the loins of his father Abraham.
Paul uses that a lot.
Yes, he does.
He uses that word.
He likes that word. Romans, and I was saying Galatians, uses it a lot. Verse 11, if therefore perfection were by the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need was there of another priest that should arise after the order of Melchizedek and not be called after the order of Aaron? Perfection. Anyone remember the word? Think. Perfection. Or perfect.
Teleos.
Okay, it's a form of that. And then it's like this. Teleosis. Here, form of teleos. It means completeness or fulfillment. It is an act or a process of consummation. Wuest has it, in defining it as an institution is perfect or complete when it affects the purpose for which it was instituted and produces a result that corresponds to the idea of it.
So would that be talking about salvation?
That's what we're dealing with here, yes. If perfection, specifically, or being more specific, the remission of sins, forgiveness of sins. What was the whole purpose of the Levitical system? It was to bring us back to God, to remove sins. Could perfection come, the removal of sins, come under the Levitical system? No way. It couldn't. And that's what we see in Hebrews 10, that the blood of bulls and goats could not take away sin. Perfection, completeness, or the fulfillment of the taking away of sins could not happen under the Levitical system. The word under it, for under it the people received the law, the word under it is the Greek word epi. E-P-I. Epi. And it means on the basis of. On the basis of this, the people received the law. On the basis of what? The Levitical priesthood. Now, it's going to become important as we go through this. The basis of the Levitical, or the law, was the Levitical priesthood. Now, just to look forward to
The basis of the Sinai revealed law was Levitical priesthood?
the basis of the law of Moses was the Levitical priesthood.
Because they call it Leviticus 10, 8 to 11. Is that what you mean?
No. What was
Why not
the Levitical system was to bring man back to God. What's the law doing? It was trying to bring them back to God. It could not do that. That's the whole reason there's the need for another Levitic or another priestly system that's not after the order of Melchizedek. But in changing that, what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to change the law. Why? Because the priestly system is based upon, or the law is based upon the priestly system. If you change the priestly system, what do you have to do? You have to change the law. Now, that's what Paul is going to argue through this as well. So the two are tied together. You cannot have the Levitical priesthood without the law. You cannot have the law without the Levitical priesthood. That's why I started out there in Psalm 110. What does it imply? That here in verse 1 and 2, you're going to see here's a king. Verse 4, he's a priest after the order of Melchizedek. What has to happen? There has to be a change of the law in order for that to take place. Now, actually, the law, and again, here's a little bit of the way in which Paul writes. He anticipates what he's going to discuss. Now then, what he's doing. For under the people receive the law. He's going to discuss the law over in Hebrews 8, starting in verse 7 and going through chapter 10 and verse 37. So he's anticipating what he's going to discuss later on. Well, we'll stop there and start there again next week, Lord willing.